It has been 56 years since the greatest achievement in the history of Homo sapiens, the Apollo 11 moon landing. Now they say it's time to dream again, to dust off our desires and hopes, the moment to remember our younger selves. Because all those fantasies we had when we were kids are about to come true. We're going back to the moon with Artemis 2. You know, I consider myself a passionate fan of space exploration. I'd even say it's an obsession. It's the driving force of my life, my greatest motivation. The fascination I feel when I observe and imagine myself among nebulas, rockets, galaxies, and planets is unmatched in my existence. In fact, my biggest dream in this life isn't a professional goal or a project, nor is it meeting an important person or traveling to another country. It's being able to travel to space and set foot on our satellite. To be able to gaze at the Earth from the vast lunar desolation. That's what it is that I long for the most. While I'm surrounded by the greatest existential void that a living being can experience, to be one with the cosmos. I should be excited about Artemis, but I'm not entirely. And I think it's precisely because of what I just told you. Because for me, this is something very serious, very personal, and I don't like it when people toy with people's hopes and excitement. Throughout my life, I've been disappointed many times in this regard, so I'm very cautious. That's why I feel bad when I see people getting so excited about announcements like this, because if you get your hopes up but are constantly let down, you get frustrated. The interest in space fades, the dream dies. And humanity loses its greatest and most epic aspiration. Few remember Apollo 18, 19, and 20, or the Soviet N-1 Bush's SI, or just a few years ago, constellation, missions, rockets, and programs that were supposed to return humanity to the moon. They all promised it, but none of them did it. The promise of the Artemis program is the same. Will it deliver unlike its predecessors? Will it deliver? In a few weeks, Artemis II will launch, the second mission of the program, the mission that will take us back to the moon. We can say we're going back because the Apollo missions were there, taking samples, planting flags, and even driving rovers. Yes, more than half a century ago, humanity was driving lunar vehicles for kilometers on another world. Going back should mean doing these things again, in the same place, right? Artemis Day, the closest it will get to all this, will be a free return circumlunar trajectory. In other words, it won't land, but it won't even orbit the moon. It will do a quick and distant flyby to gain the speed needed to return to Earth, since it doesn't have the necessary fuel to do it on its own. Can you say you've been back to the Eiffel Tower if you stay in a hotel on the outskirts of Paris for just one night, in a rush because you have to leave the next day without even visiting the city? This hurts me a little. I understand and respect that NASA and science communicators have to present it that way. Wow, I was also about to take that approach. But this is my thing, and I can't help but see myself reflected in everyone who's passionate about space, especially the little ones. I don't want them to go through the same disappointments I experienced, so at the last minute I ended up changing everything and improvising this video straight from the heart. By the way, keep in mind that even though it might seem otherwise, I consider myself a great optimist, who today will try to be realistic but never pessimistic. Remember the interstellar dream. Obviously, my concern doesn't come from this space clickbait. Most of you are aware of the reality of the mission. The problem comes with Artemis III, IFE, and the ones that follow. In these missions, the plan is to land on the moon and later build a permanent base on the lunar surface that will serve as a testing ground for crewed flights to Mars. There are several problems with all of this. 1. The rocket of the Artemis program, the SLS, can't land on the moon. It can't reach the moon. The Orion capsule, where the astronauts are, is just that, a capsule. It doesn't have engines to land, and they don't have plans to develop their own lander either. And if they started now, they wouldn't make it in time. These things take many years. 2. The only hope for the Artemis program is that the private company SpaceX develops that lander. And SpaceX is not going through its best moment. 3. The SLS is absurdly expensive, and there are very few guarantees that future administrations will maintain these exorbitant budgets. In fact, it has almost been cancelled several times. And 4. The SLS is a Frankenstein that uses parts from the long-retired space shuttle to justify contracts that otherwise wouldn't exist, something that turns it into a logistical nightmare. Artemis 2 has already been delayed by 4 years and also requires absurd space gymnastics to compensate for its bizarre architecture. Despite all this, the launch and the mission will be spectacular. I won't miss it. How outrageously expensive is it, specifically the SLS? Well, since it's one of the most powerful rockets in history, there are few comparisons available. The one that makes the most sense is Starship, the private launcher developed by SpaceX. The simplest way to understand how powerful a rocket is to calculate how much mass it can carry into space. A less powerful rocket can only take a small satellite. A very powerful rocket can take a module for a space station or a capsule capable of landing on Mars. Let's compare the biggest ones. The SLS can carry 95 tons to low Earth orbit. The Starship can already carry 100 and soon 200, but the important part comes now. A Starship launch costs $100 million if it's not reused, while an SLS launch costs $4.1 billion. That's right, the SLS is 41 times more expensive and half as powerful. You could launch 41 Starships for the price of a single SLS launch. And if Starship can be reused, which is close to being achieved, the price per launch drops to $10 million. So we're talking about an SLS launch being 410 times more expensive than a Starship launch. It's outrageous. Then there's the SLS capsule, Orion, which is not without controversy. You see, since Orion can't land, the idea for Artemis III is to launch not one but 2 rockets, a modified Starship and an SLS, so that the astronauts travel to lunar orbit in Orion and once there, transfer to the Starship to land. But this is, in my opinion, and with the utmost respect for these agencies and companies, one of the greatest absurdities in the history of space exploration. The Starship is perfectly capable of taking the astronauts from Earth. The only reason why they do 2 launches and have the first part of the trip aboard Orion launched on the SLS is to justify the existence of the SLS, nothing more. Everything would be safer, simpler, and above all, 40 to 41 times cheaper if it were launched directly with the Starship. This is directly related to the Frankenstein I mentioned earlier. 3 of the 4 engines used by the SLS used for Artemis 2, for example, already flew on space shuttle missions many years ago. And do you see these solid side boosters? Are they also recycled from the shuttle? The oldest part on board this rocket was built when Christina, one of the crew members, was only 3 years old. And recycling shuttle parts is not cheap at all. Since these are such old designs, they require very thorough maintenance and supervision to make sure everything works well. Besides, in recent decades, aerospace technology has made a huge leap. It has greatly improved in optimization, efficiency, minimalism, comfort, and safety. So, using technology from 40 years ago is a choice, a curious choice. Now you also understand why it's so expensive. This is done to justify contracts with the traditional manufacturers that are friends with the government. But SpaceX isn't exactly my favorite either. The Starship program suffers delay after delay. They still have difficulties with re-entries, and above all, they have a serious problem with fuel transfer in orbit, which is the key to all of this. Although, hey, credit where credit is due, they were the first in history to land and reuse an orbital-class rocket. They have greatly reduced the cost of access to space and have built the most powerful rocket in the history of humanity. So we are really looking at an exceptional company. The progress they've achieved in just a few years is truly unprecedented. So, if there's anyone who deserves time and patience, it's them. Now they're developing the HLS for NASA, which is the Starship variant that would be used by the Artemis III mission. The problem is that they're going to face an extremely difficult challenge. To achieve the holy grail of the future of space exploration, no less, in-orbit fuel transfer. There's a catch behind some of the low launch prices of the Starship, the fact that the ship arrives in space almost empty of fuel. This is enough for most space missions. But if you want to go to the moon, Mars, or the outer solar system, you need other starships to come up and bring you the extra fuel. You accumulate it in the main ship, and when it's full, you depart. This is very cheap to do since SpaceX reuses its ships. The only cost is the fuel and the ground operation systems. The thing is, it's very difficult. The company's own president recently expressed her doubts and concerns in Paris about whether they will succeed, especially considering the time margins that NASA needs. When an agency program suffers so many delays, it inevitably dies. What makes it so complicated? Well, it would take between 10 and 20 Starship tanker launches for Artemis 3 just for that mission. This is already a logistical nightmare in itself, but the added problem is that you have to do it very quickly because the fuel evaporates. I'm talking about just a few days. And the big challenge is transferring that fuel. In microgravity, it floats in the middle of the tanks. You need to have both spacecraft connected while at the same time accelerating in a specific direction and rotating so that the fuel moves toward the other spacecraft. It's crazy. SpaceX has gotten us used to pulling off crazy things, but this one might be too much. I hope I'm wrong too. They're expected to carry out the test in space this year, as long as there aren't any more delays. Artemis 2 won't return us to the moon, and I hope you now see why I'm skeptical about whether the next missions will. On one hand, we have the most inefficient rocket in history that's only held up by bureaucracy, with all the risks that come with it. And on the other hand, we have the most ambitious rocket in history, maybe too ambitious, since at least for now, it hasn't been able to prove otherwise. But I promised to be optimistic, so here I go. Maybe the new and definitive golden age of space exploration will be inaugurated by its true pioneers. I'm not talking about the French or the Russians, don't worry. I'm talking about the inventors of the first form of propulsion that ever existed for rockets, gunpowder. The Chinese Long March 10 rocket is being developed without major setbacks, and the tests with the other missions in the program are going perfectly. If everything continues as it has so far, before 2030 they will send humans to the moon to quickly start building permanent bases. The West depends on the tests that SpaceX is supposed to carry out in orbit this year. If there is even one more major delay, Artemis 3 will be postponed until after 2030, and China will most likely be the first. Something that will probably negatively affect Congress's support for the Artemis program. Because of this and everything discussed in the video, I believe the West will achieve it, even if it's late. I have no doubt about that. It won't be Artemis, but a new program with a different name and design that will hopefully learn from past mistakes. SpaceX will most likely be there as well, but with a slightly different methodology. In any case, whatever the program company or country is called, humanity will have won. Soon, we will be among the stars again. Soon we will dream again. And that's what matters. Uy, se me han puesto los pelos de punta un poco. Thank you very much for watching the video, and goodbye.